Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here. 7 questions for the journey of life. I realize that's the forest approach instead of the trees approach, but it was really hard for me to imagine 7 Mondays. And then I started thinking, so anyway, we'll just sort of fly to high altitude. We'll get the big scheme of things, and hopefully it'll all make sense. And there might be something else come out of it too. Okay, so the story of a brick. Some people in here know and love and have known for a long time Phil and Patty Love. Phil passed away a couple years ago. They were members here for a long time. Patty's still a member, comes at 9 o'clock most of the time with her daughter and family. But Phil is an alum of William Jewell College. And last fall, as the promo for this class said, I taught a class there at William Jewell. And so every Monday I would see that brick. Because they have this walk of donors and so forth. You don't just get a brick for graduating. It's right. It's an alum donor thing. But here's the story behind the brick, which leads to what we're talking about tonight. So Phil, just to fill you in, terrible pun, but to fill you in, when he retired pretty early, went to seminary, and then ended up through a crazy, strange set of circumstances going to Yale to work with Miroslav Volf there in a center called the Center for Faith and Culture. And it was all about this thing called Life Worth Living. And so that's where it kind of got started. Phil and Patty then gave a large sum to William Jewell to start their own Center for Faith and Culture. And that's how I even ended up teaching, is it's under that Center of Faith and Culture. There's a lot of components to that. I might say more as we go. After that, some of you will remember, during COVID, because Phil was connected with Miroslav Volf at Yale, and Miroslav Volf is connected with David Brooks, and it was COVID, so we could afford to have them, because normally if you try to have David Brooks, you're not going to be able to afford it. And so we got them because it was virtual. They were in their places, we were in our places, but over 1,000 people watched that night as they had a conversation about life worth living. And I believe it's still on our YouTube page. Then after that, we promoted life worth living courses that I taught several times, and they were virtual because it was during COVID, and I'll say more about that in just a minute. After that, Phil and Patty graciously sent me to Pepperdine University, which I always like to say is conveniently located in Malibu Beach, California. It was not a tough assignment. Spend a week in Malibu.
But it started in San Gabriel, which was far less exotic.
Yeah, well, it's right on the ocean now. And so I spent the week with Yale folks, Notre Dame folks, Pepperdine folks, and a bunch of small liberal arts colleges, learning this approach that they do at Yale called Life Worth Living. Here's how we do it. Here's how we teach it. They had breakouts. They had plenary sessions, all this kind of stuff. And quite honestly, they sent me there because they wanted us to keep teaching Life Worth Living. And it would not be, they were very clear about this, it would not be religious per se. If somebody took the course from their own religious viewpoint, fine. But there would not be a Christian component to it, a Jewish component to it. It would just be a class called Life Worth Living. And it was, for the most part, based in philosophy and social psychology. That, again, you could take it as a religious person, but that's not what it was intended to do. But the whole time, my brain, trained in biblical studies, kept thinking, well, this is how I would do it like that. So that's how I ended up writing the book, Jesus' Vision for Your One Wild and Precious Life. It's a kind of Gospels version of a Life Worth Living course that I taught at Jewell, and that, which is the next slide, I believe. Yeah, so last fall I taught the course over at Jewell, and that was not religious per se either. But as it went on, and I started to realize the majority of the students wanted to talk about it from a religious standpoint, not all on the same page, but they wanted to. that's fine, we'll do that. And so I'll show you in a minute what that looked like. I don't know what's next. I really don't. I'm thinking about writing about it, you know, differently than the book itself, but we'll see. The virtual one that we did offer here, and we had people pretty much all over the United States taking them because they were virtual. It had an intro and a concluding session, so there were 5, but the main 3 topics were these 3: self and others. What's my obligation to myself? What's my obligation to others? Pain and pleasure. I don't think I need to unpack that. We know that most of us would prefer pleasure, but there is pain in the world. And then work and leisure. And what I did at Jewel then was to say, there's a lot more sessions here. This is going to be something to flesh out. So I came up with 7 questions. What kind of person am I? The human condition. Who do I live for? Responsibility. What really matters to me? Values. What if the good life isn't always joyful? Theodicy. That's just the technical word used in philosophy and in theology for the problem of suffering. And then who do I answer to? Accountability. What am I worried about? Anxiety. What will I do for a living? Vocation. So I'm just asking a couple of questions here to get us going. What do you make of the list? Which ones interest you the most? What do you think generated the most interest among the students? Yeah?
I don't know what interested the students, but what kind of person am I, in parentheses, the human condition? That's what is taking all joy out of my life right now. The human condition that we're facing in the U.S. With all of the destruction of supports for those who are not 100% capable, for those who are not 100% whole, intellectually, emotionally. So that's, what kind of person am I in this human condition? Because what I am is frozen, unable to do anything, and full of despair, and I know that's not a life worth living.
Yeah.
It would seem for the students that many of the questions would be, they would struggle just to get their hand, get a hold of them.
Yeah.
They're big.
They needed unpacking.
Yeah, that they really have. Yeah, I think they would have anxiety. 6 and 7, they would have those nailed.
6 and 7, they would have nailed.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, the world wasn't in quite the upheaval that it is now when you taught the class. And a lot of them, I believe, were sophomores that took the class. And so what will I do for a living? You know, they really haven't keyed in on that, and they don't realize how much these other 6 questions affect them. It's kind of like graduating and getting to work.
Like, didn't
What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to ask what age they were. Were they seniors or were they?
No, they weren't seniors. They were mostly sophomores and juniors.
Okay.
Not freshmen, so they would have had some intro level courses. Some of them were already in their major, taking courses, but not graduating this year.
Didn't you say a lot of them didn't read the paper or didn't have a really good handle on current affairs? We talked about that.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Yeah. We'll talk about that. Anyone else? The one that garnered the most attention for them was the anxiety one, but because, and I'll show you in a little bit, because that was mostly about how cell phones have resulted in an anxious generation, that phrase. And they were all over that. We had a fascinating, and I'm going to tell you about it, but just for now, I'll just say that was the one that really got. They were very interested too in what they were going to do for a living. Most of them pretty much knew what they were going to do, thought they did.
Thought they did.
Yeah, thought they did. They didn't have the most realistic expectations with regard to what that entails or how much it pays. They had very little information about that. Okay, so here's what I would do if I was teaching it again, which may not happen, but could. I would combine 3 and 5. And I would just call it, who do I answer to? Values. And it would still cover the same stuff, but 7's the magic number because there's only so many weeks. And we were spending 3 days on each topic because we really wanted to immerse ourselves in the topic. So the first 2 days we're wrestling with the readings, and the third day they would start to put pen to paper about, okay, how am I going to respond to this? And then we would talk about it. But I would do that, and I would add, what's wrong with the world, social justice. Now, social justice can come up in those others, like self and others, what are my values, but this would force us to wrestle with, does social justice matter? What does it mean to you? So we'll see if that ever happens or not. As I mentioned, the course was intentionally philosophical, non-sectarian, non-religious, but I brought up theologians at times. They brought up their own upbringing in a church sometimes. So it sometimes dabbled in religion because religion's a philosophical kind of thing in itself. But in preparation for this evening, I've been revisiting an old friend. And I do mean old. Oh, hang on. St. Augustine. I mean, he'd be really old by now, right? So in another course at Jewel, they would have read Augustine's Confessions. Now, I say that they used to, in the first year, read all of the Confessions of Augustine. More recently, that course shifted and they would read parts of Confessions and parts of other things. But they did have some exposure to him. And so I want us to kind of think about these questions through the lens of St. Augustine. Okay, so I would love to, say, okay, everybody take out a piece of paper and tell me everything you know about St. Augustine. Probably most of us not a lot, but he's one of the 2 most influential people in Christian history. I mean, I'd put him up there with Martin Luther and St. Augustine. I mean, you could nominate others to make it a triumvirate or whatever number you want to get to, but he's incredibly influential, even if you've never read him, even if all you know is his first name was Saint. Well, it wasn't, of course. His first name was Aurelius, but anyway. So this is a book about Augustine by Robin Lane Fox, and I just reread it. And he notes how confessions, and let me just say, confessions is a very misleading term, because our instinct is to say, oh, you mean what he's done wrong. Well, it's a kind of play on words, and it still is in English. You can confess your faith in Jesus Christ, and you can confess your sins. And that's in essence what he does. He confesses what he was when he wasn't Christian and so forth, and he confesses what he is. And he is this believer. But he is wrestling with this, and the whole thing is written as a prayer. It's all addressed to God, which is a really interesting piece of literature. Here's the most famous line. It's only 3 sentences into it. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts find no rest until they rest in you. Not only is that the most famous line, that's the essence of Augustine. I mean, does he have other things to say? Sure. But that's the essence for him. We are made for God, made by God, and we will never find true rest until we rest in God. And of course, he's addressing it to God. And then he'll go on basically to show how he lived that out, how he had no rest until he came into that. And quite honestly, he still had struggles. It's not like, everything was hunky-dory. But there's another companion. I really like this book. The Well has 3 copies left if you're interested. On the Road with St. Augustine. Jamie Smith, he's a college professor up in Grand Rapids at Calvin College. Brilliant, brilliant guy. And he bases this book, obviously, on the writings and teachings of St. Augustine. And he has his own set of questions. Like, for instance, what do I want when I want to leave? Or what do I want when I want to belong? And he calls these questions detours on the way to myself. So you see how it's this Augustinian notion of where I'm trying to find who I really was made to be, and here's all the detours we take. Because Augustine pretty much tried them all, as we'll see. One other line, this comes from the book Miroslav wrote. It's very consistent with what we've already said. The question we ought to get to know sooner rather than later is not what do we want, but rather what is worth wanting. I mean, you can split hairs here, because really what Augustine was saying is what is worth wanting, even as he was asking what is it that we want. He knew the difference. But so we're going to dive into these 7 questions, and I'm going to sort of do an Augustinian introduction to them, and then a kind of footnote, and we can talk about them. Okay, so for Augustine, and he wasn't the only one, but he gets credit, he says humans are born sinners. And this is a Catholic doctrine that Protestants picked up on. It's in the air we breathe, it's in the water we swim in. It kind of results from 2 things. One, he thought it's because of our being conceived through the sexual act. And for him, the sexual act, well, first of all, in his early life, he indulged quite frequently and had a concubine, and he even says in the Confessions, make me pure, but not yet. But for him, this sexual act tainted, and so we were born through the sexual act, and sex is a tainted kind of thing, and so we're born sinners. And then he also had a misreading of Paul. Augustine, as brilliant as he was, didn't read Greek. He read the Latin, the Vulgate, Jerome's Vulgate. And so he misinterpreted something that Paul says, and it was this notion that when Adam sinned, we all sinned. Well, that's not in the Greek. That's in the Latin, but it's not in the Greek. So because of those 2 things, up to the present, it's a very common teaching, we're born sinners. Now, you probably hear me getting ready to say, but there's another theology. A more nuanced one sees us as capable of good and evil. We're made in the image of God, and we sin. Not we're born sinners, we're made in the image of God, but we sin. And these 2 things are held in tension. But it's not when you're born, you're a sinner. You're born in the image of God, and we tend to be a kind of people who do good and do bad. I mean, this George Steiner's take on the Nazis, he has this great quote. I mean, it's tragic, but he said, we learned during the Holocaust that soldiers could at night read Goethe and listen to Bach and go to work in the camps in the morning. Well, then you'd say, oh my God, that's just evil. Well, and then, I just kind of love this little playful piece that Fred Craddock does, where he says, if the shortstop makes the miracle catch, no one says, well, he's human. But if he messes up, we say, well, he's human. He's only human. Fred said, why don't we say that when there's a miracle catch? We are capable of incredible good and incredible evil. And these 2 things get held in tension. And it's the old thing about the rabbi who says we should walk around with 2 stones in our pockets. On the one it says, I am dust and ashes, and on the other it says, for me the world was created. And that's a healthier place. The students, they really wrestled with this. Now, some of them had a Catholic background, and so there was this Augustinian notion of born sinners. But, when you ask the question, what kind of person am I, there's a lot of places that can go, but one place it starts with, what's our nature? What is the nature of humans? And I think the most responsible answer is that we are made in the image of God and we mess up. And both those things are true. What are y'all thinking?
You're right.
I like the nuanced view just from that notion of you're born a sinner, and it to me, it's one of the things I struggled with early in life. It focuses in on, well, you can never be good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part that I always struggled with previously.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like the more nuanced of, know that there are these both sides to it. You can do good.
Yeah.
We all do good.
Yeah, it's
But
funny.
but I like how you put it, we mess up. Now,
Right.
there's mess up and then there's other acts too, don't get
Sure,
me wrong,
sure.
but I feel like that at least puts me in a better place,
Mhm.
rather than just thinking of, well, I've already got 2 strikes against me, and oof.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, I already laid out, right? There's two camps of Christianity here, but the Jews, because this is where the story comes from, it's the Adam and Eve story, right? They never have read that story as enmity between God and humanity. What the Christian branch that says we're born sinners says is we were in Adam, and when Adam sinned, they fell, and there was this fall, and humanity fell. Well, they're the ones, it's their story, right? The Jews and the rabbis said, where did you get that there was enmity? So if you ask a Jew, well, how do you get right with God? I didn't know there was a quarrel. I mean, they would say, what do you mean there's a quarrel? Now, they can do wrong, and they could repent of that. I mean, the Day of Atonement's for repenting of your sins. But you're not born a sinner. You're born in the image of God, and yes, you do sin. But your nature is not sinful. Yeah?
I've always felt that sin had more to do with free will than this inherent evil that we were this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I think of us in Sunday school this week as we watched Phoebe in class. And we watched her at church that I just cannot see her at this
She's
point
a
in
dirty,
time.
rotten sinner. isn't she?
I'm sorry, no.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the second question. Who do I live for? Responsibility. Augustine's clear, very clear, in the first half of Confessions, he will tell you that he lived for himself. He talks about stealing fruit from a neighbor's tree, stuff like that with the boys. He talks about the sex, of course. But it took him 31 years to come to the conclusion that he was made to live for God. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it was still a battle. So here's again a tension. Peter Singer is an ethicist, and he says, some of you have heard this before, you're on your way to work, first day on a new job. You've got on really nice clothes, you're running just a touch tight, it's going to be okay, you're going to be on time, but it's really close. And then you see in this fountain, this child that's drowning, little child. Well, now you've got a conundrum, right? Because you're going to get your clothes and you're going to be late. No, it's not a conundrum. It's a child drowning. There's no option but to ruin your clothes, save the child, even if you lose the job. This is the right thing to do. And Singer agrees. And then he says, but what about the children on the other side of the world that you've never seen? Do you not have some obligation to people that you do not know? Is it only the child you see? What about the ones down the street on the other side of the world, the hungry, whatever? What's our responsibility? Now, here is another ethicist, Todd May, who says this: to ask that I sacrifice things that make my life meaningful in order to assist others in their quest for a meaningful life is actually treating my life as less worthy than others. So you hear very different views there by ethicists. So one of the questions we wrestle with in the class is, what is my obligation to myself? And I would say generally 20-year-olds are pretty self-obsessed. You know, they're worlds themselves, their friends, their family. But what's our obligation to others? What do you think? You like the quote or the fountain? Or neither?
It's a tension. And as we age, we struggle with this tension. I think it's something, you've said this, and I've read it in the paper this last week, about the use of the phrase, that's a first world problem, and how that is demeaning to people who aren't in the first world, but it's also demeaning to yourself that somehow your problems are not significant. Your problems are significant. And so there's this tension. You do have self issues, but you also have need and concern for others as well.
Mm-hmm.
And how you balance that is an ongoing
Yeah,
way of.
yeah,
Who
yes,
is Todd May?
yes.
Dr. Grave, I would normally ask myself a question. See, I'm looking at the last question. How shall we live for ourselves?
Uh-huh.
I often ask myself when I kind of think I'm going in some kind of gray area, if you know what that means,
Mm-hmm.
that would you want someone to emulate your life or emulate this that you're going to do?
Uh-huh.
And that makes me think
Yeah,
before I go into the actual.
sure. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was reading an article this morning in one of the newspapers, and they were talking about, this was the 50th anniversary of something, Vietnam, leaving Vietnam, 70th, I can't remember the actually. But George Will had written 12 questions, and it was in New York Times, you could go through those 12, what do you remember? And it said, what was the central thing that changed? And it wasn't just another war, but it was the meal, I think, and seeing somebody on the paper day after day after day, and that put a face on it. And I think that with what we have now and what's going on, the absolute abject cruelty of man on man in not one spot in the United States, in the United States, in the world.
Ukraine.
Ukraine, well, all of it, Ukraine, Gaza, everything, you know, just everything is going on.
Yeah.
The inhumanity in, I wrestle with it. I remember you and I were talking about church, and you said a prayer, and I cried through the whole thing, and I said, I don't know how you wrote that. And you said, I was up all night. Do you remember you told me that? Because it was your day to pray. And what do we as Christians do when it's...
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's no easy answers to these questions, right? These are philosophical questions. You know, Singer he takes heat because he says, you have to do the utmost good you can possibly do. And he lives it. And he says you should give so much of your income and you can raise it 1% a year. And so he's very much into do all the good you possibly can. And then others, well, you know, the other spectrum side of it is Todd May, who says, well, asking me to give up so that somebody else can flourish is saying I don't deserve to flourish. Well, that's a little misleading because a lot of people will say, actually, in helping others, I do flourish, and it, you know, I get something out of it. And then somebody will say, well, is that why you do it? Because it makes you feel good, you know? And so, I mean, it's complicated because it's our motives, right? It's what's motivating us. Yes?
I always need context. I don't know who Todd May is.
He's an ethicist as well as Peter Singer is, but just with a different view on the topic. Very different view.
Todd May seems to be on, instead of abundance, there's a scarcity, it's a zero-sum game. It's kind of like that silly.
Yeah.
argument.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to keep moving. Who do I answer to? Values. For Augustine, his first 30 years were all about intellectual inquiry, self-indulgence, and a successful career. He was incredibly intellectual. He was not raised Christian. His mother was Christian, Monica, Santa Monica. You ever heard of Santa Monica? That's where it got its name from. He was what's called a Manichaean. He had this philosophy that there were two gods, one created good, one created evil, but he was brilliant, just brilliant. When he comes to faith, he writes against the Manichaeans, he writes against the Pelagians, he writes against the Arians, he writes against all these people, and he's just brilliant. He wrote thousands and thousands of pages and preached thousands of sermons. His whole thing was he wanted to be this great teacher. When he became a teacher, he wanted to be a rhetorician. He wanted to teach people how to do what we would call public speaking, and he was just brilliant. But he came to see some different values. So one way of getting at our values is to ask, what do I admire in others and what do I reject in others? So in other words, if someone says, well, what are your values? Well, that's such a weird, hard, abstract question to just say, well, let me think here. Being nice, but when you see it's something you admire in others and something that just repulses you in others or you reject in others, then you start to kind of say, well, now here's a good example, right? I like these quotes, Annie Dillard. Another way to explore it is, as she says, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. So one way to think about our values is, how do you spend your time? And that's not meant as a guilt trip, because if you say, oh gosh, I was watching Netflix, well, there's nothing wrong with that. But, it's the big picture of where do we invest. And then Kushner said, I will insist to my last day that life should be measured in 3 dimensions, not only length, but breadth. How many other people does it reach out to embrace? And depth, what values do I stand for? And we had this great discussion with the Jewel students. I mentioned how they were very unrealistic about salaries. Several of them said, I'm going to need $50,000 at least. And I was like, yeah. Yeah. But I said, do you know what the average teacher pay is? And we were doing it nationally, and it was like $69,000 or something. And I said, and the average NFL salary is $3.2 million. And I was a little bit surprised how upset they got about that. I kind of thought some of them might say, well, good for those players, they worked hard. But they actually were pretty upset by it. So I don't know, Did it make a difference? Who knows? Thoughts about this question? Okay, we'll go on.
Mike?
Yep.
Did they explain to you why they were upset about that discrepancy?
Yeah, I mean, they recognized the value of a teacher in society as opposed to a ball player. They did recognize the value.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Did any of them say they would stop watching the NFL?
No.
Did any of them say they were gonna go out for the NFL?
No, they were pretty realistic. I mean, they're at Jewel playing football, I don't think a Jewel player's ever been drafted, but maybe, I don't know. Okay, so this was a major problem for Augustine. It's a major problem for everybody, in fact. There's no solution as far as I know. Why is there evil in the world? That's another way of saying it. So for Augustine, he knew that God is all good and God made everything. So then how did evil exist? And he could never come to a satisfactory answer. But students, I had them wrestle with 2 quotes. By the way, I'll say something about these quotes. Let me read them first. Our tears are sacred. They water the ground around our feet so that new things can grow. And then Elie Wiesel, all of the abstract answers to human pain, any of them, can sound convincing until you suffer or meet someone who is suffering. So one of the things we did, and I got this from the Yale folks, is I would put 1 or 2 quotes on the board before they got there. And I might put both of these. And the first thing we did is you could go to the board and you could take a marker and you could go off of a word and you could put a question or a statement of your own. Then somebody else could come up and they could do it off of yours or they could do it off of another word or thought in the thing. So like somebody might say, my aunt has cancer. So how is that making new things grow? Or, and so they would just kind of play off of these quotes. But there's no conversation. It's just go up and write, draw a line, write, and the board just gets filled with all these comments. And it's fascinating because it was just everywhere. And then after, we do that for 10 minutes or so, I'd say, so what do you make of this? And people who had wrote, this question, taking a stance on this view, were now being challenged by somebody else's thought. And so the give and take there, but doing it silently and getting all the opinions out before you started arguing or, belittling somebody else. I didn't allow that, but you know what I'm saying. So anyway, these were the two quotes. And I don't want to forget that I personally love Kate Bowler's book. I don't like the title because you have to have the subtitle for it to be accurate. She does not believe everything happens for a reason. She calls that a lie that she loved. And so there is a theology that says, hey, everything is God's plan. You just can't quite see it yet how it works. I don't know how you tell that to 6 million Jews. I just don't know how you say that. There's really a plan here. And so this has always been the perennial philosophical, theological question. How can there be evil in the world? What do we make of it? So I'm going to pause, see what y'all are thinking.
You have a tiny little typo? Other lives I've loved.
Oh, yeah, it's lies. Yep, that's
Yeah.
a typo.
It's a great book.
Yes, it is good.
Twice.
She had cancer, and she was a scholar whose scholarly area was studying prosperity gospel preachers. Just as a scholar, she studied them. Then she got cancer. And so she tries to figure out why do they like that theology. And it's because it gives you an answer. And she could see it. She could feel the desperation. If only that were... But the book's just really, really good. And if you know somebody who's dealing with that, it's quite powerful. She has 2 appendices, one of which, don't ever say this to someone who has cancer, and then another list, here's something better to say, and it's a list. It's really quite well done. Okay, we got to keep moving because we're in the forest, not the trees. Okay, what's wrong with the world? Social justice. This is one I would add, right? In response to Christianity being blamed for the fall of Rome, Augustine wrote, probably his magnum opus, City of God. He argued that, quote, love serving God is the mark of true justice. Thus, he says, that discounts the Roman Empire. They didn't have justice and love. And Christianity at least aims for the right thing to be done. Okay, so having read, and I made a big mistake, I'll admit it in hindsight, I was weeks into the semester before I read a book about Gen Z. I just figured 20-year-olds are 20-year-old versions of what we were when we were 20. But, they got earbuds instead of whatever. But Gen Zs are a totally different creature. So I read this book, and then when I read it, I said, huh. And one of the things I read was they care about social justice. So I said on this one day in class, okay, we're going to work through the reading very quickly. I want to spend the rest of the time talking about the situation in Gaza. What do you know about it? And one person had heard of it.
When was this?
Last fall. They were totally oblivious. And I even tried to jog their memory. I said, because I thought a music festival would catch their ear. And I said, there was a music festival and a militant group crossed the border and killed people and took some hostages. It's been in the news ever since. This is Israel. It's in the land where Jesus lived. These people are over in this little part on the Mediterranean. And they were like, I don't know what you're talking about. So, I mean, we were supposed to talk about this for 45 minutes. The one young lady in the back, she not only had heard of it, she was up on the details. I mean, she was up on it. Well, she started talking. I go, wait. I don't think everybody here's following you. Because, she and I could have had a conversation, but they knew nothing of it. The only thing that got through, I told the story, I set it up, I said how people have taken sides on this, how universities are having debates and protests and riots, etc. Obviously, Jewel wasn't. But the one thing that got through to him was when I did what I call the genetic lottery. I said, okay, I've at least now filled you in. There's a group of people who are living basically in an open-air prison, and yes, a militant group from there attacked, and there's a war going on, and they're starving these people. And then I said, do you know why you were not born in Gaza? And they were like, what? I said, do you know why you were not born in Gaza? And they're like, no. And I go, you were lucky. You were just lucky. You could have been born in Gaza. You could have been a Palestinian in Gaza. And that hit them. They were like, oh. They had never thought that they could have been born in another situation. Never occurred to them. So that made a difference, I hope. I think it did. Honestly, the best thing I did in the class was pair people up. And you've heard me, some of you talk about this. Everybody in the class had a conversation partner, mostly people in their 60s and 70s who, some of them go to church here, and they, once a week, got together to talk, just to talk and share life together. And that, first day of class, when I go through the syllabus and I said, here it is, and they go, well, we don't like old people. And the last day of class, they all said, that was the best thing about the class. So.
I'm sorry, I just can't wrap my head around this. 20-year-olds
Yep.
in America where college campuses are going crazy.
Yep.
And I have a 28-year-old at 7 years who, will argue with anyone at the drop of a hat. How could it be that a group of children didn't know? I mean, TikTok and Instagram and.
But you got to go to the right, channels of it. I mean,
Yes, but
if you go to TikTok for, I don't know,
Sing and
whatever.
dance.
Yeah, a dance or a comedian or whatever, and you look and something comes up Israel Gaza. Well, who cares about that?
But you're in college, and so you're looking for things. You're looking for things related to coursework, even. And TikTok is where you go for
Yeah,
everything.
I need to recommend the Gen Z book to you because it's pretty earth-shattering. It's really earth-shattering.
What's it called?
It's called,
The anxious generation.
no, that's a different one. It's a chapter in this book, iGeneration, I believe, Generations maybe? I'll have to look it up. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's called Generations. And there's a Gen Z chapter, there's a Buster chapter, a Boomer chapter, etc. Okay, what am I worried about? This one was their number one, right? So this is a kind of hard concept to get your mind around. For Augustine and ancient thinkers, this was not an issue. The notion of anxiety is a modern psychological category. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't worry. They just didn't process the world the same way we did. They didn't think in psychological terms. They didn't think about self-fulfillment. It wasn't even that long ago. Like your grandparents, if you had a granddad that was a farmer and you said, well, is it a meaningful life farming? What? What are you talking about? We farm. It's modern categories of psychology. Again, doesn't mean they didn't worry, but they also lived in very anxious times. That was just part of the culture. Went the wrong way. So we did read the chapter, one chapter of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. And it's basically the first chapter that makes the argument that students, Gen Z in particular, they're the first generation to grow up with an iPhone. So they grew up with a computer in their pocket. And there's other stuff involved with how the world had become a dangerous place, and so they could go to the room and be on the screen. But so every day, and in the syllabus it said, you cannot use your phone in class. You can't be on your computer in class. And every day I would say, hey, remember, we're putting away our cell phones. And a minute later, they're on their cell phone. And it took me a while to realize they're not like disobeying me. They're addicted. They didn't know they'd picked it back up. And they go, oh, yeah. And they'd pick it back up, So I said, well, get yours out like I needed to say that. Everybody had it out. I said, and go to the settings and look at your screen time. So what do you think the average was per day of screen time?
17 hours.
17 hours.
6 hours, 35 minutes.
It was closer to 10 hours. 10 hours a day. Now, Haidt, in his book, makes a very strong argument that this is incredibly detrimental, especially to adolescent girls who are being body shamed, and to boys who either act out in aggression or sexuality. So I fully expected, a little, I don't know, what, argument, pushback, whatever. I was so shocked when I said, what did y'all think about that? And how do you feel about your 10 hours on average of screen time? To a person, they said, I hate it. And I was like, what? And they go, yeah, we hate it. And I said, okay, let's start over here. Because I came ready for you to say, well, yeah, you're old, you're not on your phone all the time. And that guy that wrote the book's crazy. But they were, they didn't even need to read the book. They knew that it was addictive and they hate it. And I said, well, then why are you doing it 10 hours a day? And then I realized, well, of course I know why they're doing it 10 hours a day. There's this thing called algorithms, and there's this thing called dopamine, and it works. And they've got them hooked. If I taught the class again, there would be just a big plastic bucket when you came in the door, put your phone in there, we'll pick them up and we're done.
Anonymous.
Do what?
iPhone anonymous.
Yeah, yeah. So this generation is hooked, and it results in anxiety. There are obviously other things that could lead a person to be anxious. Yeah.
I was just going to add to that. It is interesting being in an all-girls high school. No one can go to the restroom without their phone. They're not to have it in class. It's in their backpacks. But if they have to go to the restroom, they have to take their phone.
Yeah, and Haidt
And in
has,
your class, if you were to have them put it in a bucket, they would be so anxious that they wouldn't be able to concentrate.
That's
So you
true.
have to figure- They really would.
yeah, that's true. Yeah. Okay.
How were they like in terms of their ability to talk to their classmates? In terms of discussion? I mean, that's one of the things that we've heard when I've talked.
Some were very good at it, some were not. I mean, there was the whole introvert, extrovert thing, and some are shy, and et cetera. But they were when you asked them to say something, they were articulate. They could express their own views. They were not good readers. They were not good interpreters of material that they were reading, but they had their ideas, and they could express those pretty well. They really did well with the quote thing on the board where they didn't have to talk. They could just go up and write. And then I had to kind of coax it out of them. No, okay, you wrote this. Tell me what you were thinking there.
That's fascinating. Did you ever take pictures of the photos?
No, I didn't take pictures of that because I don't get on my phone that much, which is really true. Okay, so for Augustine, life was meant to be lived for God, the restless hearts thing. And I already told you he spent his life seeking to be a great rhetorician. He found his calling, though, in preaching and writing about God. Okay, so my students wrestle with two quotes. People may spend their whole lives climbing the ladder of success only to find once they reach the top that the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. They like that one, but I had to go up to the board and I wrote, how would you know what is the right and wrong wall? And they were like, oh, yeah, that's good. And then this one, I had a hard time getting them to understand this one. I think it was too mysterious. Before you tell your life what you intend to do with it, listen for what it intends to do with you. That makes more sense to adults who go, oh, yeah, just kind of listen to your body, listen to your life, and you'll. But they were just like, I'm not sure I get what that is. Pretty much every one of them could say, here's what I want to be, here's what I want to do. And some of them could express why. Like several of them did want to do something to help others. Social work, You know, and they often had, like maybe they wanted to work with the deaf community because they had a cousin who was deaf or whatever. And so some of them were in that category. A lot of them were in the category of, I want to be this, it makes a lot of money, $50,000. They had no clue how much money it takes. Okay, so the way forward. I don't know if this will make sense. Do you know how a boatman faces one direction while rowing in another? I love that line because it kind of reminds me of Augustine looking back at his earlier life. And I have more to say. Okay, so remembering our baptism. At 31, Augustine gets baptized by Bishop Ambrose at Easter in the year 387. 1 week after Easter in 2025, we're invited to reflect on our journey. And this really strikes a chord with me. Reading Augustine, it really strikes a chord with me. But in particular, this hymn. It's in our hymnal.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
This is my life right here. I was there to hear your warning cry. This is addressed to God. I mean, written from God. So this is a really interesting hymn. Hymns they're usually us talking to God. This is a hymn by God to us. I was there to hear your warning cry. I'll be there when you are old. I rejoiced the day you were baptized to see your life unfold. So I was baptized on the 15th day of my life in the St. James Catholic Church on Park Place Boulevard, not far from Houston Hobby Airport. So, and Augustine, he's 31, but you saw the picture. It's infant baptism, right? So you gotta have to play with that. I was there when you were but a child with a faith to suit you well. In a blaze of light, oh boy did I ever, you wandered off to find where demons dwell. It's a miracle I'm alive. I did so many drugs, drank so much, and would drive high. It's just, I mean, you just give me a drug, I would take it. I don't know why. When you heard the wonder of the word, I was there to cheer you on. And that is amazing that I heard the wonder of the word. You were raised to praise the living Lord to whom you now belong. When I came to faith as 19, everybody in the high school was talking about it. We had 3,000 students. They were like, who? They couldn't believe it. I still can't believe it. And then if you find someone to share your time and you join your hearts as one, I'll be there to make your verses rhyme from dusk till rising sun. In the middle ages of your life, not too old, no longer young, I'll be there to guide you through the night, complete what I've begun. When the evening gently closes in and you shut your weary eyes, I'll be there as I've always been with just one more surprise. And then it repeats, I was there to hear your warning cry. I'll be there when you are old. I rejoiced the day you were baptized to see your life unfold. You know, the notion of infant baptism, which we have done those, we do them here when people ask, but we don't typically. The notion, though, is that the church and the parents make a commitment that they will raise this child in faith who will at some point own what happened in the baptism. And we do the same thing, but we do it with infant dedication. And then they get baptized. So there's really a kind of flip-flop there and not a whole lot of distinction. But it's the notion that at 15 days old, this Catholic priest, I don't know if he's a good one or not. He puts a little water on my head. He says the words in Latin. And my Nazarene great aunt reads Bible to me. She said she prayed for me every day of my life until I came to faith. So you never know.
Did she quit then?
Did she quit praying for me? No, I don't think so. She was so happy though. And then I just thought, you know, we might want to try and write. I don't know if you've ever done this. I've done journaling, but I've never done it until recently where it's written in the form of prayer addressed to God. It's a really hard thing to do. So you don't say, you know, when I was baptized, when I was just a little kid, I mean, that's me talking, and it's talking to you. But if I'm talking to God, say, you know, you remember when I was baptized, how your priest did this. And so you write it more addressed to God, and the threefold kind of what I was, what I am, what I will be. So, okay, we got a few minutes left. What are your thoughts or takeaways?
Oh, I absorbed it all.
You did?
Oh,
Good
yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
That's great. Can you repeat it for us?
Yeah.
Summarize it for us?
Yes, anytime.
I think it's one of the best things you've done.
Oh, thanks. It's very different from what I
And it is
typically
taped.
do.
It is taped, so we can come back and listen.
It is taped, yep, it's
Yeah.
taped.
Good.
So I was interested in, I think it's question 4 or 5. What is a good life if I don't find joy?
Mm.
And so I was a bit surprised when it was the summary on there was about like the origin of evil or what generates evil. Because one of the things that when I read that in the initial list of questions, one of the things that came to me was more of that guilt, that guilt that you feel when it's and kind of comes into some of the other questions too. But when you realize you did win the genetic lottery, you know, or you win the wedding lottery like I did, and you're in a safer place that allows you to go and explore and do other things that otherwise you couldn't do, and then feeling guilty about that.
Yeah.
And you can go off that and a lot of other different tangents, but that's honestly what I was expecting that question to kind of dive into. So it was a bit, I'm not going to say jarring, but that was the one when you were going through it that struck me the most, just from kind of that difference of viewpoint.
Yeah, and when you have 2 days in a class to do just this one, and you've read, you know, a chapter of a book or whatever, you can really take it into different places. Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say on that same note, just thinking about giving up and your lesser, you know, that too much is given, much is required, always being in your head, and so that there's never a place where it's okay just to be for me. And so that, you know, just not figuring out, but just thinking about that and casting your mind there.
I wondered what textbook you used for this.
I used Miroslav's book, Life Worth Living. I don't know that I would again. I think I'd almost just go with my own kind of anthology. I would take chapters from. Part of the Gen Z thing is they have a whole acronym, TLDR, too long, didn't read. I mean, that just tells you something, that they even abbreviate too long, didn't read to TLDR. And there's all these studies that, I mean, like, we're talking about a chapter. You want me to read the whole chapter in a week? Are you kidding? I mean, I got other classes. And so if you said, you know, like I assigned quite a bit of stuff. I mean, I scaled it back. It wasn't like masters when I taught at the seminary, but it wasn't terribly amount of, but they weren't going to do that.
How old are Gen Zs now?
Well, it's a range. They could be as young as, I want to say like 13 maybe, no, 8, I think they'd be like 17 up to about 25 or something like that. I can't remember the exact.
I got exactly the same reaction, but you want me to read a whole chapter and an article when I taught women's studies at Rockhurst. And I haven't, that was from 12 to 18.
Yeah.
2012. I mean, asking a student to read was like, what?
Yeah.
But they don't read books, and what they read is off of a television.
Right. And the attention span is shorter because the layout on screens is a letter F layout. The first sentences go all the way across, and then they get shorter because ads get embedded here, and your attention span gets shorter. It's very alarming, to be honest.
I know you've done a lot of writing, Mike. I really think if you could write about this experience through the lens of St. Augustine and confessions, it would be really well received and really necessary. And I think it would tie together a lot of generations, because these 3 questions, of course, are profound for whether we're 12 or 92. But that connectivity with younger students, I think would be so powerful. And the other aspect I think would be so powerful is that we know faith or religion is at least in terms of numbers, is not quite so high. But this sense of the path forward for meaning and finding oneself, and then ultimately the message that perhaps one could best find themselves with God
Yeah.
through the experience of St. Augustine is really powerful.
Well, I highly recommend the On the Road with St. Augustine book. It's really good. 3 copies left down there. Yep.
2-part question. One, what did your students take away from the class, and would you ever consider doing like a condensed version here?
Well, I did a condensed version back during COVID.
Online.
And that's why I put on that one slide, who knows what's next. I mean, maybe we will do it again or something and do it more. You know, the pedagogy of it was, we didn't fly through 7 questions, right? We were on 1 question at a time, and we had read something, and we had a lot of discussion. So we'll see. I don't know.
What did the students take away?
Oh, yeah. Well, their main takeaway, best thing in the class, was their conversation partner. The relationship with their conversation partner. That was the best. When I asked what else they took away, they really didn't have, they weren't able to articulate. I mean, as a group, there were a few who could, but yeah. You know, when you're teaching anything, you just do what you do and you hope that it gets through. But with Gen Zs in college and, it's a required class, got to take it, whatever. You just hope that something, I mean, at the very least, they made a relationship with an older person, and it was, it was a 2-way street. I didn't call them mentors. I said conversation partner. But you also, maybe this genetic lottery thing, they just sparks and stays with them. Mm-hmm.
Do you have the conversation partners read the materials?
They could, but I didn't require it. Yeah.
I just want to say, I thought it was great that Jewel offered this class. I don't know if I would have, as a 20-year-old, taken it, but just having that opportunity, I thought was just fabulous.
So they have this.
Congratulations.
Well, they have this track where there's some options. So they didn't have to take this one, but they had a list to choose from. So it was an option within the required kind of bubble. And they'd been told, oh yeah, you got to take that class. That'll be a good class. I don't know if they thought it was or not, but yeah. And I said, well, I'll teach it on one condition. I'm going to make them meet once a week with a conversation partner. And they said, okay, sure. So thankfully they did. But Jewel's having financial issues right now, and so adjuncts like me, they may not be able to afford. So. Mm-hmm.
Didn't Jewel start as a religious affiliate?
Yeah, Southern Baptist.
That was Baptist, wasn't it?
Yeah, and they're not anymore, and they're not associated with any one tradition, but they have reclaimed a sacred kind of history, and so they're reading Augustine, they're reading the letter from the Birmingham jail. So there's exposure to what we would call the Judeo-Christian tradition, but they're not a Christian school the way they were. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I hope it was meaningful.